All right, so I want to greet you, Mr. Tangen, and I want to introduce you to our audience on Twitter Space. Mr. Tangen is an American who is living in China since, I think, 2005, if I'm correct. And he is a leading fellow at the Taihe Institute, which is the leading private think tank in China. And he's also the creator of the Asian narrative. Well, I greet you, and what we are talking about today is an evaluation of the visit of President Xi Jinping in Moscow, which concluded a couple of days ago. And if you look at the way how the Western media looked at that and Western politicians looked at that summit in difference and compared to the way how the rest of the world looked at it, it somehow demonstrates very clearly that, you know, the world is right now falling into two blocks, which I think is unfortunate, but that seems to be the tendency right now. Now, I personally think this visit was very, very important. And, you know, I think that the whole policy initiatives which came from China in the recent period, including especially the new one, the Global Civilization Initiative, I think these are really optimistic ideas. I mean, this is the idea that all cultures have something to contribute, that, you know, you must have a dialogue among all nations and civilizations on the world. And, you know, this is in clear contrast to the clash of civilization and the whole idea that the world must necessarily fall into blocks. So I would like to ask you, what is your assessment given the fact that you are sitting in Beijing, and how does this visit look from your standpoint?
Well, I mean, the visit was much needed for a number of reasons. First off, to make sure that Putin understood that he was not being forced into a corner and, you know, create a desperate situation for Russia. China has assured Russia that it will continue trading with them, that it will expand the trade. And that, quite frankly, Russian resources and Chinese manufacturing make them equal partners in a very dynamic partnership. And the reason I mention this is, you know, prior to, many years ago, the US was very concerned about Russia and Europe coming together, because Europe's ability, Europe is a peer competitor to the US. They make airplanes, medical equipment, everything that we make in the United States. Putting them together with a ready mix of resources and energy like Russia would have created a bloc that would have, in essence, been a challenge to the US. So there was a lot of desire not to make that happen. And, you know, you could see this quite clearly. 1991, you have Putin addressing the German parliament in German, talking about looking forward to his European home, making it quite clear that Russia was looking westward, that it identified itself with the West and wanted to be part of the European community. 7 years later, at the Munich Security Conference, he denounces the entire Western, or particularly US world order, because he says it has humiliated and lied to Russia. So, you know, at that juncture, I'm getting an echo. All right, okay. So at that juncture, you know, he makes it clear that he no longer believes that Russia can rise under the US, and he basically differentiates himself, but he doesn't really turn towards China until the situation starts getting very heated, especially when there was a putsch in Ukraine. Moscow's guy was out, the European American guy was in, and it set the stage for what we have today, which is the conflict there, which is killing people on both sides. So it was very important to assure Russia that they were not in a desperate situation, because the concern by Beijing was that this could turn nuclear. The second part of this is aimed at Europe. There is a sense in Beijing that there's no way to change Washington's idea about China in terms of pursuing a containment policy. But there is some hope that the Europeans do see some, they want peace. The war is in their backyard. This is affecting their economies the most, well, much more than the US.
Hello, Mr. Tangen? I think you fell out of the line.
Okay, I think I lost you there. So
Yes,
I'll start again.
2 seconds.
Okay, so are we recording?
I think so, yes. I think you should continue.
Okay. So the second part that's important is that what Xi Jinping doing is appealing to the Europeans. The war is affecting Europe the most. It's in your backyard. It's a situation where the US is actually benefiting because they can pick up additional trade in energy and also in food. And at the same time, Europe is being weakened. So as a peer competitor, right, it is not able, it is now being downgraded. You see in Germany mass layoffs at car companies, chemical companies, and it's not because they want to lay off people or that there is no demand. It's just simply they cannot be competitive producing in Europe. And they have to find other places. Some of them are coming to China. So those are the two goals. One, take the desperation off the table. Second, appeal to Europe, hopefully set this up so that it's clear that China wants peace. Russia's willing to talk. Ukraine has already made it clear that they want at least to have a talk with Xi Jinping. And at this juncture, you have Macron coming with van der Leyen to Beijing to talk about what the chances of peace are and how this might work. And then you also have echoes and a planned trip by the Prime Minister of Spain, who is very interested also in talking about this peace process. So it has had the desired effect. It started people talking. China started out prior to this by bringing together at least to start talking Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that has also kind of blossomed. You're now seeing Egypt and Turkey upgrading their diplomatic discourse to the level of ambassadors, which had been withdrawn before. You see UAE is also responding to Syria. You have the president of Iran being invited to Saudi Arabia. These things are not fixed. They could be undone, but it at least is a start. And it's a clear signal that China is very interested in peace and trying to promulgate that process, as opposed to the US, who, after saying for this last year that China must do something to bring Russia to the table, must help with the peace process. As soon as they do it, what do you hear? A spokesman saying that a truce is unacceptable. Well, I don't know how you have a talk without a truce. And I don't know, what that means, but it makes it look like the US is being very hypocritical. In terms of your comment about two worlds, I would agree. The developing and emerging world order, basically the BRICS plus the group of 77, I have had it with the kind of hypocrisy that's being espoused by the US. I mean, you saw that quite clearly when Blinken was in South Africa, and the South African Minister of Foreign Affairs, dressed him down. You come here saying you're not asking us to choose, and then all of a sudden you demand, but 2 days prior to, Linda Grenfell from the US side had been here telling me I had to choose. Saudi Arabia has also gone out on its own and made it very clear that they're going to pursue their own policies. So you're starting to see a groundswell where the multipolar world is coming in. And Xi Jinping is trying to do it, trying to.
Yes, I mean, it's very clear that the countries of the global south, which Foreign Minister Lavrov,
where Xi Jinping is trying to set up a framework.
Let me just ask you this question. You know, the global south, which has been correctly called by Foreign Minister Lavrov the global majority, they do not want to be pulled in a geopolitical confrontation between the US and Russia and the US and China. So I think that the voice of the reawakened non-aligned movement is something which must be much more brought into play, because it seems that, you know, if you only look at it from the standpoint of Europe, because Europe, you know, I mean, Germany is not a sovereign country. I mean, if you look at the behavior of the German government in respect to Nord Stream, the sabotage, it's incredible what is going on there. So I think that the initiatives coming from Xi Jinping, if you look at the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and now the new one, the Global Civilization Initiative, these are all components which really, you know, would allow for a completely new security and development architecture. And what is your sense in how is China pursuing these things so that they become efficient in the present strategic situation?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because it's an extremely important one. These three initiatives are basically about security of country, the development of countries for the benefit of their people, and then respect for the fact that each country has its own path and should be allowed to pursue that there is no one path. Now, the reason I say that is if you look at the US led model, it was always the assumption that modernity, that there's only one definition of where everybody has to be. And it's this kind of Francis Fukuyama, end of history, last man standing, liberal democratic capitalism. And then the process, modernization, was just to get people there. So, you know, from the US side, they developed American exceptionalism, which was the rationale for doing all the things that they did. It was all for the greater good. This idea that there would be one world unified under one kind of government. That hasn't worked, obviously. And the 81% of conflicts that the US has been involved with since World War II have not brought about a better and more peaceful world. So Xi Jinping has proposed something very different. He's turned the equation 180 degrees and said, let us agree on a set of guidelines for the development of a multipolar world, and let each country choose its own end according to its history, culture, legal systems, political systems. So in essence saying, look, let's agree on what we can agree on. And that is, you know, development, security, and respect for each country, sovereignty, and also culture and history. And let us use those as the glue which keeps us together, and then allow countries to figure out exactly how their path goes and where it goes. So very, very different. I
mean, that sounds like a very, you know, tolerant approach. And why do you think it is that the Western establishments still keep talking about the so-called democracies versus the so-called autocracies? And why do you think it is that the Western elites seem to be so completely unable to reflect on their own failure? I mean, the more their system is not successful, the more they seem to be convinced that they are the good ones and the other ones are the bad ones. Or as Joseph Borrell said, you know, all Europe is living in a garden and all the other people are living in a jungle, and one has to protect the garden from the jungle taking over. I mean, that reflects an arrogance in outlook, which is really, I mean, I'm trying to understand. I mean, it's not that I have not worked on that for a long time, but it's still an amazing phenomenon. You would think that the Western elites somehow come to the point and say, well, maybe we pursued a course with this Fukuyama end of history. It did not work. It caused a tremendous backlash. You know, all we have accomplished now is that the majority of the world is not working with us. Maybe it would be the time to reflect on the axiomatic mistakes in our approach. Why do you think this is not happening?
Because quite frankly, as you've just pointed out, neither Europe or America are willing to reflect. I mean, we you know, the situation with Belgium and, you know, everything that's come to light about the atrocities they created through colonialization. A lot of, you know, the West has been in power for 350 years. And there was a sense that it was God-given, that this, you know, there was some path upon which the West had been set out, commanded, you know, whether it was the Crusades or the...
Hello, Mr. Tangen. You have fallen off the line again. Oh, now you are back. Please continue. You are muted right now. I can't hear you. Okay,
somehow that it all made sense. Based on this idea that, you know, manifest destiny, that what we are doing is correct. Now, if you are the United States and you realize, if you were to reflect and say to yourself, okay, we haven't done all of these good things. We've done a lot of bad things. We assassinated people and overthrew regimes in countries around the world. But it was all based on this assumption that, you know, we have the right system. And right now, the greatest fear in Washington and in some parts of Europe is this realization that you don't have the best system, that democracy is not failing people, but people are failing democracy. You have polarization. In the US, they spent 5.5 hours talking about, you know, which cat videos children should use and whether this was a threat. And they didn't produce any evidence that there was any intent by a Chinese company, but they certainly used xenophobic racism to castigate all Chinese as these kind of lying, you know, untrustworthy people. This goes back to the you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act. You know, when they put the Japanese in internment camps, when they had laws in the books that, you know, Chinese people couldn't own land or vote or testify in court. It all goes back to that. But you know, in terms of what this means going forward, the U.S. cannot accept that the terrible things that it has done over these many years has been for nothing. That other systems, that there are systems like the one that China has for the last 45 years, which has delivered tremendous goods to their people. I mean, life expectancy has just gone up tremendously. It's now higher than in the United States, right? Income does not match the US, but from where it was, it is astounding. Double-digit growth for so many years. People now have access to medical care, to education. You know, their cities are new. China is the leading manufacturer in the world and the leading trader in the world. It has, you know, primary trade relations where it's #1 in over 150 countries. There's only a little over 200 countries in the world, so that should give you an idea. This is frightening to the colonial mindset, where it said, no, if you're not white, if you're not, you know, European or American, you know, you couldn't possibly think of something better.
But there are a whole bunch of Americans, like this General Minihan, who said that the war with China will occur in 2025. Then Senator John Cornyn just said at a Senate hearing that the difficulty to deliver the ammunition to Ukraine means that the US is not quite ready yet for the big war with China. And Congressman Tony Gonzalez also said that, you know, that we have to get ready for the war with China. So it seems to be, you know, that the mindset of many, or I don't know how many, but some forces in the United States goes in the direction that this war will come, then the whole issue of weapons to Taiwan, the whole South China Sea issue. So what do you think needs to be done to get that off the track? Because, in my view, the rise of China is unstoppable. How can you stop a country which has 1.4 billion people, which has the correct economic policy, which has a population which is highly motivated and completely different in their world outlook in terms of the optimism for the future than, for example, in the West? When you talk to people in China, they are hopeful for the future. And if you look at the suicide rate among young people in the United States, for example, or the general cultural pessimism in Europe, there's no question that, China is doing a lot of things absolutely right. So there's no way how the rise of China can be stopped, especially because it has inspired many, many developing countries, to see the chance for the first time to overcome poverty and underdevelopment. So what do you think would be necessary to get the United States, or what parts of the United States, or how to go about it, that the military-industrial complex, seems to be so addicted to the income of these wars? What can be done in your view, given the fact that you are an American, you had many high-level positions in the United States and know the United States from the inside very well? So that would be my question to you.
Well, I wasn't really high level. I did a few things at the state and local levels and things like that. And I was on a policy bank, but I was involved in politics at the national level, mostly on campaigns and things like that. So I've seen how the sausage is made. And I can tell you the only thing that will change it is a dramatic shift looks at the situation. And I think you're starting to see that. If you just after the hearings about TikTok, I would have told you that the Congress is going to go ahead and they're going to ban TikTok. But 2 days later, I can tell you that I don't know if this is necessarily going to happen, because there's 150 million users of TikTok, and about 100 million of them feel that the people they saw on television, their representatives, are fools, people who are ignorant of that which they're trying to control. It's been, laughing stock after laughing stock. So some, gormless congressman asking, he said, well, do you have to connect to, Wi-Fi, as insinuating that somehow TikTok was controlling Wi-Fi, and getting an answer, yes, if you want to connect, to the internet, you can connect through Wi-Fi. Yes, you'd have to do that. And just, so many instances where the people who are supposedly in charge of making the decision show that they were xenophobic, anti-Chinese, ignorant, all right? And, what possible basis could they have to do it? Now, 100 million people, a lot of these are voters. And assuming that they are willing to mass and say, well, these are not the people we want representing us, you could see an impact. There's also the issue of the fact that the U.S. spent 5.5 hours talking about cat videos and who should see them, but they can't seem to find the time to spend on a real big problem, which is 31.5 and growing trillion national debt, and the debt ceiling that has to be raised in order to maintain the flow of payments to the bondholders. The U.S. has been printing money for years and years. So there's low growth, there's inflation, there's political polarization, the inability of the current leadership system to deal with the issues that have to be dealt with. If, in fact, the electorate says, look, these are not the people we want representing us, then you can have a change in the U.S. You're not going to see a decrease in feeling against China necessarily, But you will have people who say, look, we don't need to be involved in a war in Ukraine. We don't need to be sending $5 billion a month to Ukraine in arms and ammunition when, you know, our teachers are going on strike because they just can't live. They're taking money from their own meager salaries in order to buy basic school supplies so that they can teach their kids. Right? There's so many issues out there. And you have a federal bank, this chap who keeps raising the rates, the damage he's doing to the economy, and also not only within the United States, but around the world. The soaring dollar is costing anybody who has a dollar loan, a dollar denominated loan. They've single-handedly, Powell has created an asset class, a toxic asset class out of what used to be considered the safest thing on earth, a US T-bill, treasury notes, right? Now, if you have a 10, 20, or 30-year treasury note, it's toxic because he's raised the rates so high that these things are going under. This is what led to Silicon Valley Bank's demise. They had, these notes. They were forced to sell them in order to get liquidity and then recognize the loss. Yes. But it's not just banks; it's pension companies. All right, I mean pension funds. It's school boards, municipalities. Right, they have all been holding and are still holding these toxic assets. And if they're forced to sell them to get the money, there's going to be consequences. So hopefully that will lead voters to say, it's time for a change.
Yes, but, in a certain sense, we're sitting on a powder keg because, there is the possibility that you could have a chain reaction collapse of the financial system because, there are so many factors. If Franklin D. Roosevelt would be alive, he would declare Glass-Steagall, he would create a new deal. And what would be the equivalent today? It would basically mean to rebuild the infrastructure. The United States has an infrastructure which is in a terrible condition. And if you compare that, for example, with China, I think everybody who travels to China and sees the incredible, I mean, in most stations, the main station is like looking like a 5-star hotel with marble, everything is clean, the trains are in time. There are 40,000 kilometers of fast train who flies through the landscape. They are very, I mean, it's very, very impressive. In the United States, you do not have any fast train. So why would the United States not say, let's rebuild our own country? I mean, it's if the United States would put their attention to what is now going into the military-industrial complex and say, let's rebuild the infrastructure, let's build a couple of new cities, let's connect with the Belt and Road Initiative through joint ventures. Do you think that is completely excluded? Because I think that the relationship between the United States and China, being the two strongest economies in the world, it may in the final instance be the question if we have world war or not. So what could be done to get the United States to accept the offer which was made by Xi Jinping several times for a new new relations among great nations? I mean, that's still on the table. So you have any ideas what could be done to get that into the conscience of Americans?
As I said, it can only be the failure of their leadership and the systems, and economically, the voters have to vote this current crew out. Replacements, but at least they'll be on track, hopefully, to understand that exactly what you said, that if America is going to be strong, if it's going to return to a land of opportunity where there's aspirations, it first has to have an infrastructure that works, right? It has to have people that have meaningful jobs. It has to be competitive. Leading with, the military hasn't worked. I read a report the other day, over the last 22 years, there's been almost $21 trillion. $21 trillion have been spent on the military. It's an astounding sum. Just imagine if they'd only spent a third of that on the military, and kept basically on par with, still be the largest military budget in the world, but the other money, $14 trillion could have rebuilt the United States, and it could have done so much for so many people in terms of not having to turn the mentally ill onto the streets, so you call them homeless. Providing the kind of medical care that people need, as opposed to enriching these insurance companies who are providing nothing. They're just basically suckerfish on the misery of other people. Yeah, I mean, it's unfortunately, I'd say it has to be a change from the bottom up, from the electorate, saying that we no longer will tolerate people who cannot lead us, and a system that is enriching the few at the expense of the many.
I want to come back to the policy offers by China, which I think is really something which has not been understood in the West sufficiently, because the Schiller Institute is fighting for a new security and development architecture, which includes the interest of every country on the planet, modeled really on the Peace of Westphalia, where the people who were negotiating came to the conclusion that if the war would continue, there would be nobody left to enjoy the victory, because everybody would be dead. Now we are in a similar situation, because if for some reason the conflict over Ukraine goes out of control, and it's escalating by the day, you can say, now this question of uranium affected ammunition. I mean, all I'm saying is we are still in an incredibly dangerous moment. And I think the idea of putting this new security and development architecture really in seriousness on the table, which would, in my view, be the combination of GDI, GSI, and GCI, the Global Civilization Initiative. I think this must be put on the table really as an absolute powerful option, so that the whole world can see it. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I think it is already on the table. I think I'm in touch with a lot of ambassadors here in China, foreign ambassadors who are here in China, and they're mulling it over. They like it. They don't know. They want to see it in action, and that, I think, is what Xi Jinping is trying to do. He's showing not, this isn't a bunch of words, right? He's able to get Iran and Saudi Arabia to at least talk. He goes to Russia, talks to Putin about peace. He's now going to, very carefully talk to counterparts in Europe, eventually, of course, Ukraine. And the idea is that it says, look, this is a Westphalian moment. We have to understand that we're not going to agree on the end and our beliefs, but we can certainly agree not to have wars, to have trade and peace between nations, and allow nations to have their own, their own path to prosperity. We're going without interference by other countries. Interference hasn't worked. The U.S. has been interfering in countries around the world since World War II, or actually way before then. You can look at the Philippines, etc. But it has a world. So at this juncture, it is very, very important that people digest this, see what China is actually doing. If they believe it, then you can have a groundswell of countries. But I mean, the U.S. is still powerful. And the American people will not understand this. All right, it's a little bit too complex. Talking about Westphalia, things like that. I mean, most Americans don't, they think Africa is still a country. It's one country. I mean, so it's difficult to convince people if they don't know. But within America, there is a very strong sense, and this is what brought Donald Trump to power, that there's something wrong in Washington, that it's become insulated, a bubble that is not interested in their concerns, only in the concerns of the very few.
Yes, so you have some more minutes, or you said earlier you are time restricted?
I'm time restricted. They just sent me a note saying you need to come in, but maybe we can continue this another time.
Yes, I would very much like that, because I think there are many, many subjects we just touched upon, which are extremely interesting, especially this dialogue of cultures, so maybe we can meet again sometime soon. So I want to thank you very much. And I think what you said will be very important for many people in Europe and the United States to listen to. So thank you very much.
And thank you for having me. And I appreciate your very insightful questions. Take care and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's so well spoken.
Yeah.
So you can still contact us and send in questions, because we didn't quite get to it. So let's continue and just contact us. You can write to my Twitter account.
Should people pose questions now?
If there are some.
Yeah, please raise your hands.
There is one. Kim, go ahead. Oh, I think you need to be set free.
Yeah, please unmute.
Unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. That was very insightful. My question is very simple. My worry is that the US government believes that it has no choice but to stop a multipolar order and the replacement of the US dollar as a reserve currency. Otherwise, the United States will suffocate on its enormous debt with a giant mountain of consequences. And the US government and its elites would face the wrath of a densely armed American public for having steered the country into ruin. It almost seems like nuclear war is just as good an option as complete ruin. And this is what I'm mainly worried about.
Well, I think that's why we have, produced a little video based on the research of one of the leading nuclear experts from the United States, Stephen Starr, who has made a video animation of what nuclear war would actually look like. And I can only suggest that all our listeners, that is you, go to the SchillerInstitute.com website and look at this video and distribute it as far as you can, because it becomes very clear, and that is also the result of the research of such experts like Ted Postol or Hans Christiansen. These are all eminent nuclear experts. If it comes to the use of only one single nuclear weapon, there is the absolute danger and likelihood that all nuclear weapons will be used. Ted Postol in particular has made studies which show the difference between conventional war and nuclear war. And the logic of nuclear war is that once you start it, all weapons will be used. That means, or even if only it would be a regional nuclear war, let's say in Asia between India, Pakistan, or whatever, the nuclear fallout would result in a nuclear winter lasting approximately 10 years, in which all life on the planet would vanish, vegetation would stop, people would starve to death. And what Kennedy once said is the people who are dying in the first hours after a nuclear war will be the lucky ones as compared to those who are dying in a horrible, painful, long death afterwards. So what these people are playing with is the annihilation of civilization. There would be not even a memory left. There would not even be a historian left to investigate why this happened, because all would be dead. All the beautiful works of Shakespeare, of Beethoven, of Einstein, everything would be gone to the dust. Nothing would be left, not even a trace. And that is what people have to understand when they have this absolutely irresponsible talk about limited nuclear war and winning a regional nuclear war and using tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, this is really the message we have to get across, because if people would know how close we are to the extinction of the entire human species, they would cut this out. I don't know if that answers your question, Kim.
Yeah, it does. But the problem is the people in power in the United States are not the moral players that would consider, all the things that you said, because they have been going around killing people for the longest time without much concern. And if they think they can survive 10 years in a nuclear bunker with swimming pools and bowling alleys, then that doesn't solve the problem at all.
Well, I think the nuclear bunkers would not help them much, because, if you cannot destroy the entire planet and then afterwards crawl out of your bunker and think you can continue civilization. And I think, I think what Mr. Tangen said before, if the US and European electorate would know these things, they would vote these people out of office. And I think that is why we need to, increase the awareness of what is the implication of all of these policy issues. This is why, to have a discussion like the one we are having right now is really extremely important.
Yeah, in my mind, the fear of those in power is that they know they are criminals and they know they have acted maliciously, and that they don't want to face the consequences when the US enters a stage of, bankruptcy and ruin. The consequences that come with that are severe.
Yeah, I know that there is the danger that we may not make it as a civilization, but I think, my hope is that right now the countries who used to be colonial countries or colonies, they are now in a completely different mode. And I think the unipolar world is gone, if the power elites in the West like it or not, because the countries of Africa, Asia, Latin America, they do not want to be treated as slaves or children or, inferior. And there is a completely new spirit. I would say the spirit of Bandung.
Anyone doubt?
What?
I have a doubt.
Who is speaking there? Let me just finish my point. I think the spirit of Bandung, which was the first Asia-African conference taking place in...
Actually, ma'am, I have a doubt.
In 1955, that spirit has fully come back, and I can only say that if more people in Europe, for example, would know that, that is happening, it would give people more confidence, because in Germany, for example, people are generally very pessimistic. If you ask people in the street, they say, oh, you can't do anything anyway. And it is this cultural pessimism which already led to fascism 90 years ago once, and cultural pessimism is a very dangerous thing. So I think if we can inject optimism that there is another world possible, I think it will be more powerful than the negative, because the good thing about human nature is, I agree with Gottfried Leibniz, who said that the world is the best of all possible worlds. And that is because every great evil tends to cause an even greater good to emerge. And I think the entire existence of the human species, is the proof of it. Because, if you think about what human creativity has produced, it is absolutely fantastic. So I don't think it's time to be pessimistic. One should recognize the danger, but then one should move energetically to make sure people know that an alternative exists.
Yeah, thank you, Helga. Maybe there's anyone else here who can help with the optimism.
I think people are timid. I don't know why. Well, now is the chance to say whatever you want to get rid of. So please use the moment.
I just had a joke in my head about the people who would hide out in their bunkers during a nuclear war and they think they can survive. Well, do you think they might have like cockroach genes or something? Just a joke.
There is still room for improvement in your jokes, but better to have a not so good joke than none. But if people have more questions about what Mr. Tannen said about China, I'm perfectly happy to make my own observations. Anna Ge?
Yeah, hi Helga. This is Anna from CGTN Radio Show World Today.
Hi, go ahead.
Yeah, it's indeed an insightful discussion. Thanks for taking this opportunity to discuss this topic, which is essential and significant, I think. What I find very interesting is how the US media and the politicians responded to China's position on the Ukraine crisis, and then later the peace deal China proposed. I remember before the deal, we've seen reports like US officials believe China may be providing Russia non-lethal military assistance in the Ukraine war. And Blinken says China may be on the brink of supplying arms to Russia. And Jake Sullivan even warned that China will face real costs if China provides lethal aid to Russia for the war in Ukraine. All those accusations from the United States are actually based on hearsay evidence. And later, after refute from China and increasing doubts about the credibility of their words, US officials noted that they've not seen any evidence of movement or decisions from China to take that step. And US National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby, when responding to the question on how serious the Biden administration thinks about China is to take the step and send weapons to Russia, he responded that they actually don't know. They have no idea about that. So it seems that the US officials have taken extra precautions to show how serious they are about keeping China from joining the conflict and intensifying it. And they've been, meanwhile, they've been selling the idea that China is the key to end the conflict. But what's interesting is that when China issued its position paper on political settlement of the Ukraine crisis, using Chinese way to put efforts on the deal, the proposed peace plan was swiftly rejected by US President Joe Biden. And it was even referred to as an attempt to distract by his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. So to me, if they had an opinion about the plan, wouldn't it make more sense to respond like, we agree with promoting peace, but controversial content needs to be discussed later, right? So, because, following China's proposal, even Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, responded that he was willing to consider some of Beijing's idea for ending the conflict in Ukraine. And he would like to meet with Chinese President Xi Jinping to discuss the proposals. At the same time, Russia said China's 12-point peace plan is being treated with great attention. And the UN, the United Nations, even stated that China's Ukraine plan is an important contribution. So with that contrast, I couldn't help asking the question like, is peace not in Americans' best interests at all? Has such question ever been well considered or discussed by the American public, after wars the US launched or involved?
Well, I think the main problem is that the mainstream media in the United States, but increasingly also in some European countries, like, for example, Germany, they do not report anything anymore without a spin. And that makes it very difficult for the average person to figure out, what is actually going on. And if people don't already have an independent idea of, what are the interests at play in the world, then, with other words, the internet allows you to find all the information, but you have to know already ahead of time what you are looking for. Nikolaus of Kues, who is this great philosopher from the 15th century, he said, you have to have a pre-knowledge in order to know that what you are finding is what you were looking for. And without that pre-knowledge, it is almost impossible to go through the incredible, rich information. So I think the key question really is to try to reach as many people as possible so that they can form their own independent judgment. And I think, China, I looked at the approach of Xi Jinping. I think on the one side, he clearly did what Mr. Tangen was saying, that he tried to give Russia the feeling that they are not isolated, to prevent Russia becoming desperate, because, if you are in the position of Russia and you see what is thrown against them, there is, in my view, a serious effort to cut Russia into many pieces, not just regime change, but there were conferences of the Jamestown Foundation, the Hudson Institute, and many other conferences and so forth, which discussed how to cut Russia into 10, 12 pieces. So, I think that aspect of China coming, of Xi Jinping coming and giving Russia, Putin, the feeling, that Russia is not isolated, which it is not. Look at the Africa-Russia relation, for example. But I think that apart from that, China is not on the same policy line like Russia. China has a very clear conception to try to lift the entire political discussion on a higher plane where conflicts can be overcome. And that comes, in my view, from the philosophical foundation of Confucianism, of the idea that you have to have a harmony. This is expressed, for example, in the win-win conception of the Belt and Road Initiative and all the other initiatives from China. So I think it's, I think that the key question, and my only criticism of China would be, that China is not doing enough to make sure that the rest of the world understands the richness of Chinese history and culture. Because if people would know that better, then they would not fall for the anti-China propaganda. I mean, my experience is that all the people who either have been in China, who are married to a Chinese, or who are doing business in China, who have invested in China, these people are normally very positive because their experience is, extremely valuable and positive. And the negative propaganda against China only works with people who have no idea, no inkling about the history or the culture of China. So I think that there would be an area where a lot more must be done, to really get the picture objectively straight.
Yes, I couldn't agree more with you. The PR side, the PR policy is definitely not Chinese government's strong advantages or the strong side. And that's also the reason we've been talking with people on the Twitter space and on Zoom to try to explain China's position and try to explain the Chinese value to those who are willing to accept or who have an open mind for different narratives or different understandings of the same topics. Thank you, Helga.
Yeah, maybe we should talk sometime about ideas, what to do about it more concretely.
Yeah, definitely.
Great. There is James. Go ahead.
Is someone ahead of me? Is it Subhashish?
Oh, Sebastian. Yes. Go ahead, Sebastian.
Thanks for allowing me to speak. So I think what is happening today is that the US is trying to maintain the unipolarity, or the US is not willing to go see the multipolar world from beginning. So that is one of the reasons why this conflict and all the conflicts that is happening right now. Because if you see, Donald Trump started this trade war against China, but Joe Biden has intensified this war with China on tech restrictions and CHIPS Act and all this. But he has tried to, bring his allies. So the Europeans are, Joe Biden has tried to form an alliance with European countries. And frankly, I would say I've been very disappointed, mostly with the European countries, because they have followed through whatever Americans have said them. So the likes of Ursula von der Leyen or even the Germans. So if you see Nord Stream 2, Seymour Hersh mentioned that the Americans were behind it, but the Germans are quiet completely. And even yesterday, Seymour Hersh published a report where Olaf Scholz himself covered up the Nord Stream 2. Similarly, in France, Emmanuel Macron has not stood up. So there have been 7 to 8 rounds of sanctions against the Russians, but ultimately it has hurt Europe. But all the European leaders, except Hungary, which has shown a independent foreign policy. None of the Europeans have shown any kind of independent foreign policy. And when China proposed the peace deal, so President Zelensky was willing to accept, but the Americans rejected it. And also NATO chief, I heard Jens Stoltenberg, and he had very harsh words to say about China, and even the Europeans are very suspect towards it. So I think that is the reason why the Europeans completely neglected Russia and its concerns regarding NATO. So this war could have been averted before, because the Russians tried to negotiate, but the Americans completely and the Europeans completely didn't heed to the Russians. And even after in Turkey, there were some negotiations going on, but Boris Johnson and the Americans went there to stop the peace process. And now, even when China is trying to do something, John Kirby clearly said the Americans don't want any kind of peace at this moment. So that's why I feel it's very unfortunate what's happening, that the US is trying everything to pull down China, to contain China, at the same time contain both Russia and China, and Europe to some extent is implicit in that. So I just wanted to ask one question as to why the Europeans are so hesitant towards a multipolar world, why they do everything the Americans tell them to do, even if it completely hurts Europe. And is Ursula von der Leyen the sole, like what positions does she have said that she can dictate everything to the Europeans and they have to accept her? Thank you.
Well, that is actually the $64 million question, or better, $64 trillion you have to say with inflation. If I would know the exact answer to that, I would have done something about it. I think it is only explainable through a combination of factors. One is that Germany, for example, which, in one sense, if Germany would take a independent, sovereign policy, I think all of Europe would, go in a different direction. So I think the German situation, in one sense, is the key. I mean, what's happening with Germany right now is unbelievable. The German economy is completely deindustrialized right now. You already have many small and medium firms, restaurants, bakeries, all kinds of craftsmen who are going belly up, because of the energy prices, because of the general inflation. So you would think that the population is rising up. Well, we have to see. Tomorrow is all of Germany going to be practically coming to a standstill because two major trade unions are working together, which means the entire transport will be shut down, and that's supposed to last for 3 days. Now, I think it may have something to do with the fact that people are looking to France, and France right now is since many days, almost weeks, really in an uprising against Macron, it's not just about the pensions, the pension age, it's the whole austerity, because if you spend so much money on weapons, sending to Ukraine, rearmament and militarizing Europe, naturally, these are all incredible sums which are lacking elsewhere. So the education systems are not functioning. The pupils leave schools more stupid. The people are generally confronted with a worsening health system. Now the present German government, the Greens in that government are dismantling Germany. I mean, they want to impose measures which mean the deindustrialization of Germany. Now, why is that? Because the Green Party has become the total war party. If you look at Baerbock and Habeck, Baerbock is like joined at the hips with Blinken. You can't differentiate these two people. And what these people are doing is so much detrimental against the interest of Germany that I do not exclude the possibility that the ferment which exists in France right now, which is about the future of France, it's not just about the pension age, that will somehow affect the German discussion as well, because these things go up to a certain point, but when it becomes intolerable, when the very existence of so many families and households are at stake, I think we may see an uprising in Germany in the coming period as well. And that is obviously mixed with the nascent peace movement, which is emerging. There was a big demonstration in Berlin, beginning of March, with 50,000 people that's not yet millions, but it is already a very sizable beginning. If you look at Holland, you know, the farmers are in absolute uproar because they realize that the present EU policies will mean the destruction of Holland, of the Netherlands, Dutch agriculture. So, you know, while I'm also very disappointed about the present policies of Europe, I think that we are right now looking at a transformation because the pain is just becoming too big. So, you know, that is not a sufficient answer to your question, which I think involves many factors, going back all the way to, you know, why the German classics was undermined and why, you know, the re-education of by the occupying powers after the Second World War, and there were many waves of paradigm shift which account for the present behavior. But that is a long discussion, so I want to leave it at that and express my hope that, you know, that we are now at the verge of a change where people take their own interests better into their own hands.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the answer.
James?
Hi. So I think, like, I mean, obviously the West is completely inundated with propaganda. And I think a lot of people, because of the propaganda, like, they don't even know what the problem is. And so they don't even know what the solution is. And most people have no idea what derivatives are or how bad the banking situation is. You know, I was just watching Biden in Canada and just looking at the lunacy going on in there as far as, you know, all these ideologues and technocrats who are just beholden to a broken, failed system. I mean, the fact that you have these Green Party people who supposedly care for the environment, and they haven't even said one word about eco-terrorism with the Nord Stream. I mean, we're living in, I mean, like, society is completely gaslit, and I understand the need to tell people and to try to awaken people to the truth about China and about the world situation. But I mean, we're facing a massive, you know, I mean, just getting past the propaganda wall is very daunting. And then you have the money printing that just goes on and on and on. And I'm just wondering, like, how, like, you know, like a lot of the leaders perhaps in Europe, they could be under blackmail. I mean, we don't know. Like, I mean, they could just be ideologues. But how long can the money printing continue before the derivatives bubble bursts? And how can new leadership arise when like, it's pretty much impossible to even get into leadership without being compromised in some way?
Well, you know, the Schiller Institute is an institution which exists now for more than, well, no, wait a second, yeah, almost 40 years, 39 years. And we have, you know, not changed our attitude. We started out with the idea of a new world economic order, which would be more just, in combination with the need to have a renaissance of classical culture. And, you know, in all these periods, and naturally my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, started this already in the late 60s. So we have become an institution which is, you know, I mean, the fact that we survived all of that, despite enormous efforts to contain us, has, you know, has made a important impression on many forces in the world who regard the Schiller Institute by now as a very important place, a factory of ideas, as the you know, the late Justice Minister of the United States, Attorney General Ramsey Clark, once called it, you know, that we are a factory of ideas. And, you know, we have started many years ago, but especially since the war in Ukraine happened, to organize what I call a movement of world citizens, because the danger of world war which would annihilate the entire civilization, makes automatically every citizen a world citizen, because, if the oligarchy is threatening us with world war, well, then we are world citizens because the whole world is our concern. So this idea that we have to form a movement of world citizens of all countries uniting around the idea that we need a paradigm shift, that we need to go into a more human relation among nations, respecting sovereignty, respecting essentially the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which is also the basis for the UN Charter. That is a very important idea. And we have, especially in the last half year, had a whole bunch of conferences where we had legislators from Latin America, both sitting ones and former legislators, a former president of a Latin American country, former ministers from Argentina, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, and that is spreading. We are now having many people in Africa who basically agree with us that the global South, the global majority, has to take a larger role because, you cannot leave it to people who are trying to impose their interest against the interest of the majority of the world. So my hope is that from the developing countries who are now in a real Renaissance spirit, or Bandung spirit, I would say, that they will play a much bigger role, and that hopefully the people in Europe will recognize that it would be in their very best interest if they cooperate with the global South and not try to contain it. So then hopefully if all these voices appear as a chorus worldwide, this will impact the United States, because the United States is also not homogeneous. We have the LaRouche movement, we have the LaRouche organization, which, Diane Sayre, working as a candidate for Senate, as an independent LaRouche candidate. She made a very successful campaign against Schumer. She's now in the race for 24. There are many other forces in motion. The demonstration which took place in Washington on the 19th of February was a deliberate effort to unite everybody from the left to the right, so-called, and basically say, look, we can solve our differences later. Let's first concentrate to stop the war danger. And a similar process is happening now in many other countries. So rather than saying it's all terrible, which it is, I think you should join, and everybody who's listening should join our effort to build a real movement for a new paradigm in international politics. We have a big new conference on April 15th and 16th. You can find the invitation for that on the website of the Schiller Institute. And if you agree with at least a part of what I said, you should become active with us. Okay, now we have another question from Kathleen.
Yes, good morning. I live in the United States. It's still very early here. First, I just want to thank you so much for this conversation. I had a lot of difficulty getting to the conversation because of the problems with the Twitter room, and I bet a lot of people had that problem. So I just wanted to thank you and to express sorrow that we weren't able to all hear that speaker at the beginning. I only caught the last few words of what he had to say. But thank you, Helga, for setting this up and for letting us talk together. The thing I want to ask you is for some advice. I totally agree with the idea of this paradigm needing to shift in our world. And we are totally inundated here in the United States with the propaganda like y'all have been talking about. And my little project is that I've organized a circle of 60-some people who are advocates for peace who want to lobby our legislators. We have a bunch of people in the US, but also quite a few in Europe and other places too, South America, and even somebody in Ethiopia. So we have this circle of people who want to lobby our legislators in the cause of peace. We're lobbying our legislators because we know they too are inundated by this stupid propaganda. So I wondered if you have advice for me in, I formulate little prompts that people can use when they call their legislators or email their legislators. And I wondered if you have advice or counsel for me. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it would be good if we would somehow unite our efforts. So maybe you can contact us in the United States, because we are doing lobbying in the Congress and also some of the state legislators as well, and also in Europe and Latin America. So if we would maybe connect and unite our efforts, it would amplify them. I think, you know, on the content, you know, I think that the two main initiatives, what we are working on right now is this idea that we need a new security and development architecture, which includes the interest of every country on the planet, because that is the lesson from the Peace of Westphalia, that if you want to have peace, you have to consider the interest of every single country. If you don't do that, it does not lead to peace. And the best example of that is the Treaty of Versailles, you know, which was basically very biased and gave the only guilt to Germany, which historically you cannot argue it because it was much more the British influence and many other influences. So since that was not considering the interest of everybody, it led to World War II. So you have to learn the lesson that the Peace of Westphalia was successful because it considered the interest of everyone. And I think we need to apply that recognition to the world today, which means a new security architecture has to take into account the interest of every single country on the planet, which includes Russia, China, the United States, Europe, Africa. Africa is a continent and not a country. Many countries, and you know, also Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Syria, Yemen. All of these interests have to be taken into account, and that is only possible if you have a conception of development, which is why we are calling it a security and development architecture, because the new name for peace must be development. And I have written 10 principles what such a security architecture could be based on, which I want you to read. And maybe if you agree with these 10 principles, that may be something you would want to include in your argumentation. That proposal of these 10 principles is being circulated right now by many forces in many countries. It's obviously not the final answer, but it is a very comprehensive approach on how you would go about it. And in that sense, it's a unique proposal, which I think needs to be discussed. So that is really the most important. And, you know, I think the more countries and the more people we get involved, the more we tend to counterbalance this propaganda dominance in the so-called West. There are many more things I could say, like, for example, we have also an initiative to have an emergency conference to reorganize the bankrupt financial system. And in that proposal, you know, there is the idea that it should be done either by the UN General Assembly, because it does affect the whole world, or by the G20, because they are supposedly more or less representative of the whole world. And if these two institutions can't do it because there are countries in them who would oppose it, which is quite possible, then the responsibility shifts to the BRICS Plus, which definitely represents the vast majority of the human population, because it's not only the BRICS, but it's about anywhere between 16 and 24 countries who have applied for membership in the BRICS Plus, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the African Union, the ASEAN, the Eurasian Economic Union. But somebody, some combination of countries must take the leadership in this crisis. So I would encourage you to join these efforts or include those folky in what you are doing, and maybe we should touch base after this call.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I will put my email in the chat. Anybody who has ideas for me, feel free to email me. And I really appreciate your comments, Helga. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, there are no more questions right now. So I would invite you to come back next Sunday, tell many people about the existence of this Twitter space, and whoever wants to work with the Schiller Institute more closely, put your email into the chat and we get back to you, and we should amplify our forces and do that with optimism that we can win, because I definitely think that while the danger is very big, I also trust that the human nature is stronger than the forces of evil. So that is really all I wanted to say, and I'm running out of time a little bit. So if you have some urgent question, email it to us and we'll answer you. Otherwise, let's meet again next week.